What's going on? My name is Matt Parker, and today we're asking the question, are vintage bass guitars really worth it? And stick around to the end of the video because I'm going to give you 2 reasons why they might not be the purchase for you. So on any given day on the internet, you can find people discussing, are vintage guitars really worth the premium, or are modern building techniques far superior in every way? So in this video, I'm going to give you 5 reasons why I think vintage guitars are worth it. So reason 1 is probably the most obvious, and that is as an investment piece. So in the last 10 or 15 years, the vintage market has really exploded. Collectors, live players, studio guys are looking for this kind of coveted golden era of music tone, which you can get from some of these old instruments. Basses like Fender's Precision and Jazz have definitely been leading the charge. These are probably the most valuable in terms of vintage basses typically. Certainly this pre-CBS era of kind of the 50s through to the mid-60s is kind of what people are looking for if they're looking for a real investment opportunity. Subsequently, as these prices have continued to climb, it's also had a knock-on effect on the 70s models, with early and mid-70s pricing now starting to creep up towards £4,000 or £5,000. It's also worth noting that as people are starting to get priced out of the market for vintage Jazz and Precision basses, they're starting to look back through the Fender catalogue and look at some of the other offerings around this era, which can still be picked up fairly reasonably. These include basses like the Fender Mustang and the Fender Music Master. Now, when these were released, these were considered student models, but they're now also starting to climb in value as people are looking for a more affordable way to get into vintage Fenders without having to spend, astronomical figures on pre-CBS J and P basses. In terms of Gibsons, some models to look out for would be the EB2 we've got here, the Gibson Grabbers and Rippers of the 70s, and also the bicentennial Thunderbird. Other models to look out for would be early examples of the Music Man Stingray pre-Ernie Ball with the 2-band black epoxy preamp and the iconic Rickenbacker 4001. As prices continue to climb, vintage instruments just appear to be a really good investment. It's almost like functional art you can enjoy all the time. It's gradually increasing in value. It's probably worth noting at this point, I'm not a financial advisor. Make investment at your own risk, but enjoy some vintage basses along the way. Now, the second reason I think vintage basses are worth it is the feel. I've been lucky enough to play a ton of vintage Fenders and Gibsons, and there's definitely something to be said about the way these basses feel when they're being played. Now, typically these basses are obviously very old and they've had multiple owners, so often they feel like really played in. You can always tell when someone's really loved a vintage instrument because, like patches of finish on the neck are missing. And often with these basses as well, they've got a nitrocellulose finish, which wears in really nicely. And this played in feel and the wear on the finish definitely feels very different to a modern instrument. A modern instrument you can kind of play for like 5 years and it still feels really kind of like new and clean when you wipe it down. Whereas an older instrument starts to feel kind of like worn in and like really shows its character. This is one of the things that I think people are talking about when they talk about mojo. They're talking about this kind of like worn in, kind of like a comfy old pair of slippers feel, where they just pick up the instrument and it feels like it's got a bit of a story to tell. The third thing is the sound. If you're interested in vintage instruments, you're probably looking to replicate the kind of golden era of music. This is really considered kind of music from the late 50s through to the mid 70s. Many of these recordings feature absolutely iconic instruments such as early Hofner violin basses, early Fender Jazz basses, obviously Rickenbacker 4001s, and it goes without saying, probably the GOAT of the bass world, the Fender Precision bass. One of the things that people often mention when they're talking about vintage basses is the way that they sound quite mellow in the mix. Now, these basses would have been shipped with flat wound strings, and also due to the age of the basses themselves, if they've got the original pickups, these pickups lose magnetism over time, which definitely helps roll off some of the kind of harsher treblier frequencies and gives you like a really, really kind of like mellow, warm character. This is often why people find that vintage P basses strung with flats sit really well in the mix. And this often is why producers really love P basses in the mixes, because they've had 75 years of being able to master and mix the P bass and know how it's going to react. Now, I have owned kind of 6 or 7 vintage basses at this point, from kind of Fender, Gibson, Rickenbacker, and all of them have sounded absolutely great in their own way. But one of the things that they have in common is that they do sound slightly different to kind of modern basses, where often the output is slightly higher as pickups become more and more overwhelmed. Number 4 is the playing experience. Now, vintage instruments often were at a time when brands were still exploring the ergonomics of the instrument, and as such, they're not always the fastest things to play. If you take this EB2, for example, it's got really wide nut width and a really thick neck front to back, which I personally love. These specs, however, definitely slow you down in your playing. They can often make you feel a little bit more intentional about your note choices, which is something I find with vintage P basses as well, certainly with the 44.5mm nut widths. Now, because of these rounder radiuses, and often fret wire used to be a lot smaller, and obviously with 40, 50, 60, 70 years of playing time on them, some of the frets can be imperfect. Can't always bend the instrument to your will as much as a modern instrument, but in return, you kind of really lean into the flavor of the instrument instead. And actually, it's something that sounds counterintuitive, but I actually love about vintage instruments. Sometimes I can't slam an action like I like, and it actually means that I end up playing different lines, which then listening back through recordings like, oh, that sounds great, when in reality what I might have done on a modern bass is just kind of like noodle away and be less intentional about my playing. And for me, the 5th reason vintage instruments are worth it is being able to be directly connected to the basses and sounds which help shape modern music. Now, obviously, I'm aware these are kind of luxury items at this point. A lot of vintage instruments are priced out of most players reaching the market, but there's definitely something intangible about being able to play basses that had direct impact on the shape of music at the time. Now, my own EB2D here was from 1964, and they only made around 340 in that year. But 1964 is also the year my dad was born. My dad's always been a huge champion of me playing instruments and, shaping my early musical journey. And for that reason, this is just kind of a bit of a sentimental instrument for me, to be honest. I like the fact that it's the same age as my dad. My dad was the person who got me into music. And so whenever I pick this bass up, I always just kind of feel connected to it in some sort of way. It just kind of like helps re-solidify my roots and kind of what I enjoyed when I was first picking up the instrument. Whenever I pick up this bass, I always wonder about its story because it's got a load of cool wear, the neck finish is all worn off. Had a headstock break as well, so obviously something's happened to it at some point, but that doesn't worry me. It means that I could actually buy this at a price I could afford, and it's really one of my favorite basses. I absolutely love having this thing around. To be honest, it makes me feel a bit of a rock star when I play it. There's something about the kind of like ES335 shape which I just adore, and I think it's just such a quintessential kind of like iconic shape at this point. Now, for those of you still watching at the end, I said at the beginning I was going to give you 2 reasons vintage basses might not be worth it for you. So here's number 1. The first thing is the price of entry. It's no industry secret at this point that vintage basses can be particularly expensive, and one of the side effects of this is that sometimes you can be reluctant to take them out on the road. Now, me personally, I've always loved taking vintage basses out because I think there's almost like a duty to show these basses to younger generations and to get people interested in vintage instruments and the history of modern music. If you want to watch a video on my 1972 jazz bass, click here. I took that jazz bass on around 40 gigs last year, and it did really well. And since getting the Gibson in October of 2025, I've also been taking that out to a load of gigs as well. But recently I had an incident where someone kind of tripped over when they were trying to invade the stage, and they caused some minor damage to this instrument. And since then I've had to reassess what I'm happy with taking out to certain gigs. This has made me way more wary about taking vintage basses out. If you're taking something that's cost you £3,000, £4,000, £5,000, it's not going to be that easy to replace, and the fear of damage is always in the back of your mind. Because of this, they often stay at home on the rack, and that means they get played less, which is actually counterintuitive and something I disagree with. One of my pet hates is when you see collectors, buying up the entire stock of some place and then just putting away in a vault as an investment, which I think is just so counterintuitive to the history of rock music, the history of guitar music, the history of bass, and I just think that that is wrong on so many levels. As prices continue to increase, we're going to see this more and more, and I think it's going to get to a point where we don't really see any vintage instruments out at all anymore, and people will be using things like custom shop, replicas, and things of that nature. The second reason is not all vintage instruments are good. When we talk about vintage instruments, we often have this kind of like golden era ideology in our mind, and we think that these basses are all going to be absolutely incredible, and that just simply isn't the case. When we think about these instruments, they were all basically built by hand, and there's a ton of differentiation in between models which might be really close in serial number. I'm lucky enough to have played dozens and dozens of vintage instruments at this point, and I've probably played maybe 6, 7 or 8 that have been truly incredible. I played probably the same again, which have been pretty good but nothing special, and I've probably played the same again in things that have just been absolutely awful. When you think people are paying upwards of £10,000 for a custom colour P or jazz bass that might not be a particularly good sounding or playing instrument, it does feel a little bit worrying that these prices continue to increase. Another bonus reason they might not be for you is the maintenance costs. Obviously, these instruments have been around for a long time and parts fail on any instrument, but if you're looking to keep these instruments original, you can be paying hundreds in replacement parts. Often you're looking for parts on the second-hand market to keep the originality, but you might be looking upwards of $200 for a single machine head. You know, if you're looking for a bridge from an early Gibson, you could be looking at $400. A scratch plate for a pre-CBS Fender might be kind of $200 or $300. And you can be looking at the same again for era correct pots. Often as well, the necks might have some issues because they've been under tension for, kind of 50, 60, 70 years. And, these can also kind of affect the playability. It's also not uncommon for these instruments to need a fret dress and sometimes a fret replacement. And if you are looking to get rid of the original frets, this can impact the value. Now, my personal conclusion is I absolutely love the way these basses feel to play, and I love the spirit they invoke in my playing when I pick them up. For me personally, I don't care about originality too much. For me, I like the body and the neck to be as original as possible. The electronics are obviously an added bonus, but I don't mind if there's been a couple of little changes. It's got a different pick guard on it or something like that, because it means you can usually get a bargain. For me, as a custodian of the instrument during my lifetime, I feel it's really important to get them, kind of in the eyes and sometimes in the hands of the public as well. There's been a few times now when other bass players in the crowd have come up and asked me about the instrument, and I've let them go through my rig at the end of a gig or at the beginning during a sound check. And I think it's really important to get these in the hands of as many people as possible so they too can appreciate the history of these instruments. So there we go. Let me know in the comments, would you buy a vintage bass? Have you owned vintage basses? Have you been disappointed by vintage basses, or have you found some cheap bargains at a pawn shop which you've absolutely loved? Let me know in the comments, and thank you so much for watching. Please remember to like and subscribe, as it really helps me grow this YouTube channel. And until next time, I'll see you soon.